The morning fog hung low over the English countryside, as it always did in early autumn, and through that gray mist walked a man who had spent more than half his life tending to soil that was not his own. His name was Eduardo Mendez, and he was 60. 3 years old, with hands that told stories his mouth never would. Those hands had touched thousands of roses and pulled countless weeds and planted more seeds than any person could ever count. But they had also once done something else entirely. Something he never talked about, something he had buried so deep inside himself that most days he almost forgot it was there. Eduardo had worked at the Harrington estate for 32 years, and in all that time he had become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak trees that lined the gravel pathways. Other workers came and went over the decades, but Eduardo remained constant like the seasons themselves. He arrived each morning before sunrise when the world was still quiet and the birds were just beginning to stir. He would walk the ground slowly, checking on his plants the way a doctor might check on patients. Each flower had its own personality, he believed, and each needed different care, different attention, different love. The estate was massive, stretching across nearly 40 acres of manicured gardens, wild meadows, and dense woodland. At its center stood the manor house, a grand Victorian building with more rooms than anyone could possibly need. Eduardo had seen the inside of that house only a handful of times over the years, and always just the kitchen or the back hallways where the staff moved quietly. But there was one part of the manor that nobody entered. The East Wing parlor had been sealed shut since 1987, the year Lady Catherine Harrington passed away. She had been the last of the original family to live in the house, and after her death, the estate had passed through various hands. Distant relatives who never visited, investment companies who saw only numbers on paper, caretakers who maintained the exterior while letting the interior gather dust. Through all of this, Eduardo remained. He had known Lady Catherine briefly in those early years when he first arrived from Portugal as a young man of 31. She had been kind to him in a way that wealthy people often are not kind to their workers. She asked him questions about his homeland, about his family, about his dreams. He remembered one conversation in particular that had stayed with him across all these decades. She had found him one evening sitting alone in the garden after all the other workers had gone home. He was staring at nothing, just sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, and she had approached him quietly. "You have the hands of an artist," she said to him. He looked up, startled, because he had not heard her coming. She smiled at him gently and said that she could always tell when someone had trained their hands for something delicate. Eduardo had not known what to say, so he said nothing at all. She did not press him further, and that was the last real conversation they ever had. 3 months later, she was gone, and the East Wing was sealed, and life continued as it always does, whether we want it to or not. Now 37 years after that conversation, Eduardo found himself standing in front of the manor house, watching a moving truck pull up the long driveway. The estate had been sold again, but this time to people who actually intended to live there. A young couple in their early 30s had inherited the property from some distant connection that even they did not fully understand. Their names were James and Sophie Whitworth, and they arrived on a Tuesday morning with their 2 young children, and more enthusiasm than Eduardo had seen in years. Sophie was the first to approach him as he worked near the front garden beds. She introduced herself warmly and asked if he was the famous Eduardo that the estate agent had told him about. He did not know he was famous for anything, but he shook her hand politely and welcomed her to the property. Over the next few weeks, Eduardo watched as the young family began the enormous task of bringing the old house back to life. They hired painters and electricians, and plumbers and specialists of every kind. The manor buzzed with activity for the first time in decades. Eduardo kept to his gardens as he always did, but he noticed the changes happening around him. New curtains appeared in windows that had been dark for years. Laughter echoed across the grounds as the children played. The house was waking up after a very long sleep. Then one afternoon, Sophie found Eduardo near the greenhouse and asked if he might help with something inside. "We want to open up all the sealed rooms," she explained, "and we could really use someone who knows this place." Eduardo hesitated because the inside of the house was not his territory and he was comfortable with boundaries, but something in her eyes reminded him of Lady Catherine all those years ago, and so he agreed. They started with the simpler rooms. First, storage closets filled with forgotten furniture, bedrooms thick with dust and memories. Each door they opened released air that had been trapped for decades, and Eduardo found himself breathing in history with every step. On the third day of this work, they reached the east wing. The hallway leading to the parlor was darker than the rest of the house, and Eduardo felt something shift inside his chest as they approached. Sophie carried a ring of old keys that had been found in a drawer, and she tried them one by one until finally the lock clicked open. The door swung inward, slowly creaking on hinges that had not moved since Eduardo was a young man. Dust swirled in the light that poured through the doorway, and for a moment, nobody moved. Room was large, with tall windows covered by heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light. Furniture stood like ghosts beneath white sheets, gray now with age. Sophie stepped inside first, followed by James, who had joined them for this particular unveiling. Eduardo remained in the doorway, his feet suddenly unwilling to carry him forward. The room smelled of old wood and forgotten time, and something else too, something that made Eduardo's heart beat faster, though he could not explain why. Sophie began pulling sheets off furniture, revealing chairs and tables and cabinets that had been preserved in this strange time capsule. James opened the curtains and light flooded the space for the first time in nearly 4 decades, and that was when Eduardo saw it. In the corner of the room, beneath a large gray cover, sat a shape he would have recognized anywhere. The curve of it was unmistakable, the size and the proportion and the way it commanded the space around it. His breath caught in his throat, and his hands, which had been steady through decades of physical labor, began to tremble. Sophie noticed his reaction and asked if he was all right. Eduardo could not answer her. He was looking at that covered shape and seeing something else entirely. He was seeing his mother's living room in Lisbon 50 years ago. He was seeing himself as a boy of 12, sitting at an instrument just like this one, practicing scales, while his mother cooked dinner in the kitchen. He was hearing her voice calling out to him to play something beautiful. He was feeling the weight of all those years pressing down on him like stones. Piano beneath that cover was a Bissendorfer Grand. Eduardo knew this without even removing the sheet, because he had spent the first half of his life learning every curve and corner of instruments. Just like I had trained at the Lisbon Conservatory as a young man, and his teachers had called him gifted. They said he had something special in his fingers, something that could not be taught. They said he would perform in concert halls across Europe and bring audiences to tears with his playing. They said many things that never came true, because life has a way of interrupting our plans, and grief has a way of silencing the music inside us. Eduardo turned away from the piano and walked out of the room without saying a word. He went back to his garden, where the soil was familiar and the plants did not ask questions. He knelt beside a bed of roses and pushed his hands into the earth, as if trying to ground himself. But even as his fingers worked the dirt, his mind was back in that dusty parlor, standing before the ghost of everything he had once been. That night, he lay awake in his small cottage at the edge of the estate property. He stared at the ceiling and remembered things he had not allowed himself to remember in decades. He remembered his mother teaching him his first notes. He remembered the smell of the conservatory practice rooms. He remembered the night before her funeral, when he played one final time and then closed the piano lid and walked away forever. Sleep did not come until nearly dawn, and when it finally did, Eduardo dreamed of music. He dreamed of a boy with quick fingers and a full heart sitting at a beautiful piano, while his mother listened from the doorway. In the dream, she was smiling, and even in sleep, Eduardo felt tears running down his weathered face. The days that followed were difficult for Eduardo in ways he could not explain to anyone. He went through the motions of his work as he always had, but something inside him had shifted. Every time he passed near the manor house, his eyes would drift toward the east wing windows, and he would feel that tightness in his chest return. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just an old piano in a dusty room, just wood and strings and hammers and keys. But he knew better than that. He knew that some objects carry weight far beyond their physical form. He knew that some things can unlock doors inside us that we thought we had sealed forever. Sophie noticed the change in him, though she was too polite to say anything directly. She would bring him tea in the garden sometimes and sit with him while he worked. She asked gentle questions about the plants and the history of the estate, and he answered them as best he could, but she never mentioned the piano, and neither did he. A week passed, and then another, and Eduardo convinced himself that he could simply ignore what had happened. Had been ignoring it for 40 years after all. What was a few more decades? But the dreams would not stop. Every night now he found himself back at the conservatory in Lisbon, walking those long hallways with their high ceilings and polished floors. He could hear music coming from the practice rooms all around him. Young students working through their scales and etudes, just as he once had. In these dreams, he would search for something, though he never knew what. He would open door after door, finding empty rooms or strangers at pianos who did not look up when he entered, and then he would wake with his heart pounding and his pillow damp with sweat. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Eduardo arrived at the estate even earlier than usual. The sun had not yet risen, and the grounds were completely still. He walked without thinking and found himself standing at the back entrance of the manor house. The door was unlocked because James and Sophie trusted their small community and saw no need for excessive security. Eduardo stepped inside, telling himself he was just checking on something, just making sure everything was in order. The house was quiet except for the old creaks and groans that all ancient buildings make in the early hours. He moved through the back hallways, past the kitchen and the service areas, until he reached the main corridor. From there it was only a short walk to the east wing. His feet carried him forward, even as his mind screamed at him to turn back. The parlor door was closed, but not locked, and when Eduardo pushed it open, he found the room exactly as they had left it. The furniture still uncovered and dusty. The curtains now open, letting in the first gray light of dawn. And there in the corner, the piano sat waiting. Eduardo stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking at it. The Bissendorfer was old, but even from across the room, he could see that it had been well made. The craftsmanship of those Austrian builders was legendary, and this instrument had clearly been someone special. Once Lady Catherine must have played, he thought, or perhaps it had belonged to someone before her, someone who loved music the way he once had. He took one step into the room, and then another. Each step felt like moving through water, heavy and slow and deliberate. When he finally reached the piano, he stopped and placed his hand on its surface. The wood was cool beneath his palm and slightly rough from years of neglect. Dust had settled into every groove and corner, turning the black lacquer gray in places. But underneath all of that, Eduardo could feel the quality. He could feel the care that had gone into building this instrument. His mother would have loved it. That thought came unbidden, and it nearly knocked the breath out of him. His mother had been a music teacher in Lisbon, and she had spent her entire life surrounded by pianos. She could not afford a Bissendorfer herself, but she had taken young Eduardo to see them whenever she could. They would visit the finest music shops in the city, and she would ask permission for him to play just a few notes. The shopkeepers always said yes, because even then people could see something special in the boy with the serious eyes and the quick fingers. His mother believed in him more than anyone else ever had. She worked extra hours giving lessons to wealthy children so that Eduardo could attend the conservatory, she sacrificed everything she had so that he could have the training he needed, and he had been good. He had been so very good. His teacher said he could be one of the greats if he kept working. They talked about concert halls in Vienna and Paris and London. They talked about recordings and competitions and a life filled with music. Eduardo believed them because his mother believed them, and her faith was the foundation of everything he knew. Then his father got sick. It happened suddenly, the way these things often do. Day he was healthy and strong, and the next he could barely get out of bed. Doctors said it was serious, and the treatments would be expensive. Eduardo was 22 years old, and his final year at the conservatory, his whole future was laid out before him like a red carpet waiting for him to walk. But his family needed money, and there was only one thing of value they owned: the piano. It was not a Bissendorfer, but it was a fine instrument. Nonetheless, his mother had inherited it from her own teacher, and it had been the center of their home for as long as Eduardo could remember. She sold it without telling him. Came home one afternoon to find the corner of the living room empty and his mother sitting alone with tears streaming down her face. She apologized over and over, saying she had no choice. Medical bills were mounting, and they had nothing else. Eduardo held her and told her it was all right, even though something inside him cracked that day. He finished his studies at the conservatory, using the practice rooms there since he no longer had an instrument at home. He graduated with honors, and his teachers still spoke of his brilliant future. But 3 months after graduation, his father died anyway. All that sacrifice and all that money, and none of it had been enough. His mother followed 6 months later. Doctors said it was her heart, but Eduardo knew better. She died of grief, plain and simple. She died because losing her husband had taken something essential from her, and she could not go on without Ed. Eduardo was 23 years old and completely alone in the world. He had his talent and his training and absolutely nothing else. The night before his mother's funeral, he found a piano in the church where the service would be held. He sat down and played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor because it had been her favorite piece. He played it perfectly with all the emotion and technical skill his years of training had given him, and when the final note faded into silence, he closed the lid and walked away. He never touched a piano again. That was 40 years ago now. Standing in this dusty parlor in the English countryside, Eduardo felt all of those years pressing down on him at once. He built an entire life around avoiding this moment, had crossed an ocean and changed his profession, and buried his past so deep that most days he could pretend it had never existed. But here was this piano waiting for him, like an old friend who had never given up hope. Eduardo pulled out the bench and sat down slowly. His bones protested the movement because he was not a young man anymore, and his body carried its own memories of hard labor. He lifted the fallboard that covered the keys and looked at them for the first time. They were yellowed with age, but intact, no chips or cracks that he could see. Just 88 keys waiting in silence for someone to bring them back to life. He raised his hands and held them above the keyboard. His fingers trembled, and he could feel his heart beating so hard it seemed to shake his whole body. 40 years since he had allowed himself to even think about playing. 40 years of silence and denial and grief pushed down so far he thought it might never surface again, but here it was rising up through him like water from a deep well. He thought about his mother and her unwavering faith. He thought about his father and the illness that took everything from them. He thought about the young man he had been, so full of promise and dreams, and he thought about the old man he had become, bent and weathered, and alone his hand still hovered over the keys. Unable to make that final connection. What if he had forgotten everything? What if 40 years had erased all those countless hours of practice? What if he pressed a key and nothing happened? What if the music was truly gone forever? Alder sat there frozen between the past and the present, unable to move forward and unwilling to go back. The sun had risen fully now, and golden light poured through the windows. illuminating the dust that floated in the air around him. It was beautiful in a sad kind of way, this room that had been forgotten for so long finally touched by light again. Maybe that was what he needed to. Maybe after all these years of darkness, it was time to let the light back in. Eduardo took a deep breath and lowered his right hand. His index finger touched a single key, and for the first time in 4 decades, a note rang out beneath his touch. The note hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. It was slightly out of tune after so many years of silence, but it was real, and it was alive, and Eduardo felt it vibrate through his entire body. He pressed another key, and then another. Each sound was imperfect, but each one stirred something deep inside him that he had thought was dead forever. His left hand joined his right, almost without him deciding to do so. Muscle memory is a strange and powerful thing. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. His fingers found positions they had not held in 4 decades, and suddenly, he was not an old gardener sitting in a dusty room. He was a young man again, full of dreams and promise, with the whole world stretched out before him. The first few notes were hesitant and clumsy, like a child learning to walk after a long illness. Eduardo made mistakes that would have horrified his teachers back at the conservatory. His timing was off, and his fingers stumbled over passages that had once flowed like water, but he kept playing. He did not stop to correct himself or start over or analyze what was going wrong. He simply let his hands move and trusted that somewhere inside him, the music still existed, and slowly, almost magically, it began to come back. The Chopin nocturne that he had played the night before his mother's funeral emerged from his fingers like a ghost. Returning home, the melody was shaky at first, but with each phrase, it grew stronger. Eduardo closed his eyes and let the music carry him away from this room and this moment and this life he had built around forgetting. He was back in Lisbon, in the small apartment where he grew up. He could smell his mother's cooking and hear his father's laughter and feel the warmth of a home that no longer existed anywhere except in his memory. Tears began to fall down his weathered cheeks, but he did not stop playing. These were not tears of sadness exactly. They were something more complicated than that. Relief and grief and joy and pain all mixed together into something he could not name. 40 years of silence poured out of him through his fingers and onto those yellowed keys. The piano responded to his touch despite its neglected condition. Bissendorfer had been built to last, and even after decades of abandonment, it still had voice enough to sing. Eduardo played through the entire nocturne from beginning to end. When the final notes faded into silence, he sat perfectly still with his hands resting on the keys and his eyes closed. He was breathing heavily, as if he had just run a great distance. In a way, he had run across 40 years of his own life and arrived somewhere he never expected to be. Sound of soft crying made him open his eyes. He turned toward the doorway and saw Sophie standing there with her hand pressed against her mouth and tears streaming down her face. She was holding her phone in her other hand, and Eduardo realized with a start that she had been recording him. How long had she been standing there? How much had she seen? He felt suddenly exposed in a way that made him want to flee back to his garden, where things made sense and nobody asked questions. But Sophie stepped into the room before he could move. She walked toward him slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Eduardo could see that her emotion was genuine. This was not politeness or flattery. She had been truly moved by what she witnessed. Eduardo did not know what to say. He had spent so many years hiding this part of himself that he had no words prepared. For a moment like this, he looked down at the piano keys still glistening slightly from his tears. I did not mean to intrude, Sophie continued. I heard the music from upstairs and I thought maybe James had turned on a recording or something, but then I came down and I saw you, and I could not make myself interrupt. She paused and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Why did you never tell us you could play like that? Eduardo took a long breath and considered the question. It was such a simple thing to ask, but the answer was anything but simple. How could he explain 40 years of grief and guilt and silence? Could he make her understand what it meant to walk away from the thing you loved most in the world? I stopped playing a long time ago, he finally said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough from disuse when it came to talking about these things. There were reasons, and they seemed good at the time. But maybe some things should not be stopped forever. Sophie nodded as if she understood, even though she could not possibly understand completely. She looked at the piano and then back at Eduardo. This instrument belonged to Lady Catherine, she said. Did you know that she was a pianist too? Eduardo shook his head. He had only spoken to the woman a handful of times, and she had never mentioned music to him. Sophie explained that she and James had found old photographs and letters in some of the other rooms. Lady Catherine had trained in Vienna as a young woman and had even performed in concert halls across Europe before she married and moved to this estate. She gave it all up for love, Sophie said. Her husband did not approve of public performance for women of her status, so she stopped playing for audiences, but she kept this piano and she played for herself every single day until she died. Eduardo listened to this story and felt something shift inside his chest. He and Lady Catherine had been alike in ways. He never knew both of them had walked away from music for different reasons, but with the same result. Both of them had let silence fill the space where songs used to live. But Lady Catherine had kept playing, at least for herself. She had not let the music die completely. Eduardo had done something worse. He had buried it so deep that he convinced himself it no longer existed. Maybe that was why she said what she said to him all those years ago in the garden. You have the hands of an artist, she had told him. Perhaps she had recognized something in him that he was trying to hide. Perhaps she had seen a kindred spirit and wanted him to know that she understood. Sophie sat down on a dusty chair near the window and watched Eduardo with gentle curiosity. Will you play something else? She asked. Eduardo hesitated. Part of him wanted to close the piano and walk away again. It would be so easy to return to his garden and pretend this morning never happened. But another part of him, the part that had been sleeping for 40 years, wanted desperately to keep going. He turned back to the keyboard and let his fingers find their position. This time, he did not play Chopin. He played a simple Portuguese folk song that his mother used to sing while she cooked dinner. It was nothing complicated, just a sweet melody that reminded him of home. But as he played, he felt his mother beside him in a way he had not felt since she died. He could almost hear her voice joining the music, filling in the words. He had nearly forgotten the song ended and Eduardo sat in the warm silence that followed. Sophie did not speak, and he was grateful for that. Some moments need space to breathe. Finally, Eduardo stood up from the bench and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The dust and the neglect and the years of abandonment no longer seemed sad to him. They seemed like a cocoon waiting to break open. This piano needs tuning, he said to Sophie, and cleaning and probably some repairs inside. If you want, I could take care of it. Sophie's face lit up with a smile that reminded Eduardo of his mother when she used to watch him perform. We would love that, she said. And maybe while you work on it, you could play sometimes. Eduardo nodded slowly. Maybe I could, he said. Words felt strange in his mouth, like a promise he was not sure he could keep. But as he walked out of the parlor and back toward his garden, he realized that something fundamental had changed. Wall he had built around that part of himself had developed cracks this morning. And once a wall starts to crack, it is only a matter of time before it comes down completely. He spent the rest of the day working among his roses, but his mind kept drifting back to the feeling of those keys beneath his fingers. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without dreaming of the conservatory. Instead, he dreamed of his mother sitting beside him on a piano bench. She was smiling, and her hand rested gently on his shoulder. Play something beautiful, she said. And in the dream, he did. Sophie had not planned To share the video with anyone beyond her closest friends, she sent it to her sister first with a simple message saying, "You will not believe what happened this morning." Her sister watched it and immediately forwarded it to 3 other people. Those 3 people shared it with their own circles, and within hours the video had traveled far beyond anything Sophie could have imagined. By the next morning, it had been viewed over 50,000 times on social media. By the end of the week, that number had grown to nearly 2 million. Eduardo knew nothing about any of this. He spent his days in the garden as always, and his evenings in the small cottage at the edge of the property. Did not own a computer, and his old mobile phone was only capable of making calls and sending simple text messages. The internet and its strange ways were a mystery to him, and he preferred to keep it that way. So, when Sophie came running across the lawn one afternoon with her phone in her hand and excitement written all over her face, Eduardo had no idea what was coming. She showed him the screen and tried to explain what had happened, but the numbers meant nothing to him. 2 million views, she kept saying. 2 million people have watched you play. Eduardo stared at the small screen and saw himself sitting at the piano in that dusty room. He watched his own hands moving across the keys and heard the chop and nocturne filling the air. It was strange to see himself from the outside, like watching a stranger who happened to share his face. He did not know what to say. Sophie explained that people all over the world had been moved by his performance. They were leaving comments by the thousands, sharing their own stories and expressing emotions that the video had stirred in them. She read some of the comments aloud, and Eduardo listened with growing disbelief. A woman in Argentina wrote that she had not spoken to her mother in 5 years, but after watching this video, she picked up the phone and called. A man in Korea said he had given up painting 20 years ago, but this inspired him to buy new brushes and start again. A teenager in Canada confessed that she had been thinking about dropping out of music school, but now she was determined to continue. Story after story poured in from every corner of the globe. People saw themselves in Eduardo. They saw their own abandoned dreams and forgotten passions reflected in this old gardener who had found his way back to music after 4 decades of silence. Eduardo did not know how to process any of this. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding attention, and now suddenly millions of strangers knew his face and his story. It felt like standing naked in the middle of a crowded room. Sophie sensed his discomfort and apologized for sharing the video without asking his permission first. She had not expected it to spread like this, and she felt terrible for putting him in such an uncomfortable position. Eduardo told her it was all right, even though he was not entirely sure that it was. He could not be angry with her because her intentions had been pure. She had simply wanted to share something beautiful with the people she loved. How could he fault her for that? The days that followed were overwhelming in ways Eduardo could never have anticipated. News outlets began contacting the estate, asking for interviews. Television programs wanted to feature his story. A documentary filmmaker from London drove all the dinner of all them way to the countryside hoping to meet him. Eduardo said no to all of it. Was not interested in fame or attention or any of the things that seemed to matter so much to the modern world. He just wanted to tend his garden and maybe play the piano sometimes in the quiet of the morning. But the messages kept coming, not just interview requests, but personal letters from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his story. Sophie printed them out and brought them to him in stacks because she knew he could not access them on his own. Eduardo read every single one. He sat in his cottage at night with a cup of tea and worked through the pile. Slowly, each letter was a window into someone else's life and someone else's struggle. A retired factory worker in Detroit, who had always dreamed of learning guitar, finally signed up for lessons at age 71. A widow in Australia started writing poetry again after decades of believing her creative years were behind her. A young father in Brazil who had given up his art career to support his family decided to set up a small studio in his garage and paint on weekends. These were not famous people or extraordinary achievers. They were just regular human beings who had let life push them away from the things that made them feel alive, and somehow watching Eduardo play had given them permission to try again. One letter in particular stayed with him long after he finished reading it. It came from a woman in Lisbon who was now in her 80s. She wrote that she had been a student at the conservatory many years ago, and she remembered a young man named Eduardo Mendes, who everyone said would become one of the great pianists of his generation. She had wondered for decades what happened to him. Simply vanished, she wrote, and nobody knew where he went. We all assumed he had moved to Vienna or Paris to pursue his career. We never imagined he had stopped playing entirely. She went on to say that his teachers had spoken about him for years after he left. They used him as an example of natural talent, and they mourned the loss of what could have been. But now she understood that some losses are not permanent. Some things that seem gone forever are only sleeping and waiting for the right moment to wake up. Eduardo put down that letter and wept. He wept for the young man he had been and for the decades he had lost. Wept for his mother, who had believed in him so completely, and his father, whose illness had set everything in motion. He wept for Lady Catherine, who had recognized something in him and tried to reach out, and he wept for all the people around the world who were now finding their own courage because of a video they watched on a tiny screen. The next morning, Eduardo walked to the manor house with a new sense of purpose. He found Sophie in the kitchen making breakfast for her children, and he asked if he could use her telephone to make a call. She handed it over without question, and Eduardo dialed a number he had looked up in one of the letters. It was the number for a piano tuner in London who specialized in restoring antique instruments. The man on the other end of the line was surprised to hear from him. He had seen the video like everyone else, and he offered to come to the estate free of charge. He said it would be an honor to work on the piano that had been part of such a meaningful story. Eduardo accepted the offer, and arrangements were made for the following week. When he handed the phone back to Sophie, she was looking at him with curiosity. He explained what he had done, and she smiled. "Does this mean you are going to keep playing?" she asked. Eduardo thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about his mother and her unwavering faith. He thought about the letters from strangers who had found hope in his story. He thought about all the years of silence and all the music that had been waiting inside him. "Yes," he finally said, "I think maybe I am." Sophie hugged him then, and Eduardo was surprised to find that he did not mind. He had spent so long keeping people at a distance, but something was changing inside him. The wall that had started to crack was crumbling now, and he was beginning to see that there might be something beautiful on the other side. That afternoon, he returned to the parlor and sat down at the piano once more. He played for hours, moving through pieces he had not thought about in decades. Some came back easily, and others required patient work to remember. But with each passing hour, he felt more like himself than he had in 40 years. The music was not gone. It had never been gone. It had only been waiting for him to find his way back. A year passed, and the seasons turned as they always do. Spring gave way to summer, and summer faded into autumn, and autumn surrendered to winter before the cycle began again. Through all of these changes, Eduardo remained at the Harrington estate, doing the work he had done for more than 3 decades. But everything was different. Now the piano tuner from London had arrived as promised and spent 3 full days working on the Bissendorfer, replaced worn hammers and adjusted the action, and tuned each string until the instrument sang with a clarity it had not possessed in decades. When he finished, he played a few notes himself and then stepped back with tears in his eyes. "This is one of the finest pianos I have ever had the privilege to restore," he said. "Lady Catherine must have loved it very much." Eduardo thanked him and tried to pay for his work, but the man refused to accept any money. He said that being part of this story was payment enough, and that he would remember this experience for the rest of his life. After the tuner left, Eduardo sat down at the restored piano and played for the first time on an instrument that was finally whole again. The difference was remarkable. Every note rang true and pure, and the touch was responsive in ways the neglected piano had not been before. Eduardo felt like he had been given a new voice after years of speaking through damaged vocal cords. He played every day after that. Each morning, he would arrive at the estate before dawn and tend to his garden duties until midday. Then he would walk to the manor house and spend the afternoon in the parlor with the piano. Sophie and James welcomed this routine and often left the door open so the music could drift through the house. Their children began to linger outside the parlor, listening with wide eyes as Eduardo worked through his repertoire. Older one, a girl of 7, asked one day if he could teach her to play. Eduardo looked at her small hands and remembered his own hands at that age reaching up to keys that seemed impossibly far apart. He said, without hesitation, they started with simple exercises, just learning where the notes lived and how to hold the fingers properly. The girl was not a natural talent the way Eduardo had been, but she had something equally valuable. She had enthusiasm and patience, and a genuine love for the sound she could create. Eduardo found that teaching her brought him a different kind of joy than playing alone. It was the joy of passing something precious to the next generation. It was the joy his mother must have felt when she first placed his small hands on the keyboard. All those years ago, word spread through the village that the famous gardener was now giving piano lessons. Other families approached him asking if he would teach their children too. Eduardo agreed to take on a few more students, and before long, his afternoons were filled with young people learning the basics of music. He did not charge money for these lessons. He told the parents that their children were giving him something more valuable than currency. They were giving him purpose and connection and a reason to keep playing. The offers from the outside world continued to arrive throughout the year. Concert halls sent invitations for him to perform. Recording studios wanted to capture his playing for albums. Television programs still hoped for interviews and documentary features. Eduardo declined them all. He had no interest in stages or spotlights or the kind of attention that came with public performance. His music was not for audiences of thousands. It was for himself and for the children he taught and for the memory of his mother who had believed in him when no one else did. But he did accept one invitation. A small music school in Lisbon reached out to him through the woman who had written that letter about remembering him from the conservatory. They were not asking him to perform. They simply wanted him to visit and speak with their students about the importance of never giving up on the things you love. Eduardo thought about this request for several days. Returning to Lisbon would mean confronting ghosts he had spent 40 years avoiding. It would mean walking the streets where he grew up and passing by the building where his family once lived. It would mean facing the conservatory where his dreams had been born and where he had walked away from them forever. But something inside him said it was time. He had been running from his past for 4 decades, and running had not brought him peace. Maybe going back would. Sophie helped him book the flight and arrange for someone to cover his garden duties while he was away. James drove him to the airport and wished him well with a firm handshake that said more than words could express. The flight to Lisbon was only a few hours, but it felt like traveling across a lifetime when Eduardo stepped off the plane and breathed Portuguese air for the first time in over 30 years. He felt something crack open in his chest. The city had changed in many ways, but it was still recognizable. The light was the same golden Mediterranean glow he remembered from childhood. The sounds and smells and rhythms of life were familiar in a way that made him want to weep. He visited the conservatory first. The building had been renovated since his time there, but the bones were the same. He walked the hallways slowly, listening to young students practicing behind closed doors. A woman met him at the entrance and introduced herself as the director of the school. She was perhaps 50 years old, and she looked at Eduardo with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "The students are so excited to meet you," she said. "Your story has inspired many of them to keep going when things get difficult." Eduardo spent the afternoon talking with groups of young musicians. He did not lecture them or give grand speeches about perseverance. Instead, he simply told them his story in plain words. He told them about his mother and her sacrifices. Told them about losing everything and walking away from music. He told them about the decades of silence and the dusty piano in a forgotten room, and he told them about finding his way back. The students listened with an attention that surprised him. They asked questions about technique and practice and the challenges of maintaining passion over a lifetime, but mostly they asked about how it felt to play again. After so long, Eduardo thought carefully before answering it. Felt like coming home. He finally said, "Not to a place, but to myself. I had been living as half a person for 40 years. The music was the other half, and without it I was never complete." On his last day in Lisbon, Eduardo visited the cemetery where his parents were buried. He had not been to their graves since leaving Portugal all those years ago. The headstones were weathered, but still legible, and someone had placed fresh flowers there. Recently, perhaps a distant relative, or maybe just a kind stranger who tended to forgotten graves. Eduardo knelt on the ground and spoke to his mother for the first time in decades. Told her about the piano and the video and the letters from around the world. He told her about the children he was teaching and the joy he had found in passing along what she had given him. And he told her that she had been right all along. "Music will find you again when you are ready," she had whispered to him on the day they sold the piano. He had not understood those words at the time. He had been too angry and too hurt and too young to see their wisdom, but now at 64 years old, he finally understood. The music had always been there, waiting inside him. Like seeds buried beneath winter snow, it had waited through decades of grief and silence and denial, and when he was finally ready, it had bloomed again. Eduardo flew back to England the next morning and returned to the Harrington estate that same afternoon. Sophie greeted him at the door with a warm embrace and asked how the trip had been. He told her it was exactly what he needed. That evening he walked to the parlor and sat down at the Bissendorfer one more time. The sun was setting outside. The tall windows and golden light filled the room. He thought about Lady Catherine, who had played this same piano in this same light decades ago. He thought about his mother, who had given him the gift of music before giving him the gift of letting it go. He thought about all the students around the world who were picking up instruments today because they heard his story, and he began to play not Chopin this time, but something new, a melody that had been forming in his mind during the flight home. It was gentle and hopeful and tinged with the kind of sadness that makes beautiful things more beautiful. He played until the light faded completely and the room fell into darkness. Then he closed the piano and walked out to his garden. The roses were blooming despite the late season, and their fragrance filled the evening air. Eduardo stood among them and breathed deeply. Tomorrow, he would plant something new near the parlor window, a flower that would bloom each year around this theme, a living reminder that some things only need patience and care and time, and that it is never too late to become who you were always meant to be.